Behind the diner counter, a quiet cook whispered something to a homeless boy, and the undercover boss froze mid-bite. One rainy morning in Southside Chicago, a quiet man walked into a small diner and ordered the simplest thing on the menu: toast and black coffee. Nobody inside knew he was the billionaire owner of the entire restaurant chain. He wasn't there for the food. He was there to watch. But while he sat in the corner booth, yet he heard something behind the kitchen counter that made him stop mid-bite. A cook was whispering to a hungry boy, promising him he wouldn't have to sleep in a car forever. In that moment, the undercover boss realized he wasn't just watching his business. He was about to discover the kind of man who could change it forever. The cold came early that morning in Southside Chicago. A thin mist hung over the streets, clinging to the faded brick buildings and the old traffic lights that blinked red and yellow above empty intersections. The sidewalks still glistened from a night of steady rain, and puddles reflected the flickering neon sign of a small diner squeezed between a laundromat and a pawnshop. Sunrise Corner. The sign buzzed softly in the gray dawn. Inside, warm yellow light spilled out through fogged windows, carrying with it the smell of coffee, butter, and something faintly sweet that clung to the air like a memory. The bell above the diner door chimed. A man stepped inside. He moved quietly, the kind of quiet that came from someone used to walking through rooms without drawing attention. His coat was plain, dark gray wool, slightly damp from the mist. A navy baseball cap sat low on his head, hiding most of his face. Beneath it, his eyes scanned the room with calm precision. The diner was half full. 2 construction workers sat at the counter eating eggs and bacon before their shift. A nurse in scrubs cradled a mug of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her awake. An older couple shared pancakes in a booth near the window. No one looked up when the man entered. That suited him just fine. He slid into a booth near the back wall, where he could see almost the entire diner: the kitchen window, the front counter, the narrow hallway leading toward the restrooms. As a waitress approached with a coffee pot already in hand. She looked tired but kind, the way people often looked in places like this before the sun was fully up. "Morning," she said gently. "What can I get you?" The man glanced at the menu but barely read it. "Just toast," he said. She paused, pen hovering. "Just toast? And black coffee?" She nodded, a little surprised but not enough to ask questions. "You got it?" She poured the coffee and walked away toward the kitchen. So the man wrapped both hands around the mug. Steam curled upward in soft spirals, warming his face. Outside, a city bus roared past, spraying water across the street. Inside, forks clinked against plates. A coffee machine hissed softly. And somewhere behind the counter, a voice spoke. Low, warm, gentle. The man wasn't trying to listen. But the words drifted through the open kitchen window anyway. "Hey, slow down," the voice said. "Oh, food ain't going anywhere." There was the faint sound of a chair scraping. Then a smaller voice answered, young, hungry. "I'm sorry." The man's eyes lifted slowly toward the kitchen window. A tall black man stood behind the counter, wearing a faded yellow hoodie beneath a diner apron. His shoulders were broad, but his posture carried a softness that made him look less like a cook and more like someone's older brother. Marcus Reed. Though the man in the booth didn't know his name yet, Marcus placed a plate down on the small stainless steel prep table. 2 scrambled eggs, toast, a slice of orange. Nothing fancy. But the boy sitting across from him looked at it like it was a feast. The boy couldn't have been older than 9. His jacket was too thin for Chicago mornings. The zipper hung crooked, and one sleeve had been patched with gray duct tape. Marcus leaned on the counter, watching him eat. "Easy, kid," he said again, smiling softly. "You inhale it like that. Now your stomach's gonna fight back." The boy slowed down, chewing carefully now. The man in the booth raised his coffee mug halfway to his mouth. He should have taken a sip. Instead, he froze because of what Marcus said next. Marcus lowered his voice slightly, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "One day," he told the boy, "you won't have to sleep in that car anymore." The words hung in the air. The boy didn't answer right away. He kept chewing. Finally, he asked quietly, "Oh, you promise?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "I do." The man in the booth felt something shift inside his chest. He slowly set his coffee mug back down. The waitress returned with his plate. 2 slices of toast, lightly buttered. She slid it onto the table. "There you go," she said. He barely noticed. His attention was still fixed on the kitchen window. Marcus reached into the refrigerator and pulled out a small carton of milk. He set it beside the boy's plate. "Drink that too," Marcus said. "Growing kids need more than toast." The boy smiled. A real smile. The kind that showed a missing tooth. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus." Marcus chuckled softly. Just Marcus. The waitress noticed where the man in the booth was looking. "Kid comes in most mornings," she said quietly. "Marcus feeds him before school." The man finally looked at her. "Does the owner know?" She shrugged. "Rick knows." Rick. The name carried a weight the man didn't miss. The waitress leaned closer. "And Rick hates it." She straightened and walked away. The man in the booth picked up his toast at last. But he didn't eat it. He watched. The boy finished his breakfast and wiped his mouth with a napkin. Marcus ruffled his hair gently. "Bus'll be here soon," Marcus said. The boy nodded. "Thanks, Marcus." He hopped off the stool and slipped out the back door. Marcus watched him go. For a moment his smile faded. He turned back toward the kitchen sink. And that's when another voice exploded from the office door. Sharp. Annoyed. "Marcus!" A man stepped out wearing a pressed button-down shirt and the permanent scowl of someone who believed kindness was bad for business. Rick Dalton. "Why's the food count off again?" Rick barked. Marcus didn't turn around. "I'll cover it." Rick scoffed. "You always say that." The man in the booth leaned back slowly, still watching. Rick crossed his arms. "You think this place is some kind of charity?" Marcus finally turned. "No," he said calmly. Rick smirked. "Then stop acting like it." The diner grew quieter. Forks paused. Coffee cups hovered midair. Marcus said nothing. Rick shook his head and stormed back toward the office. The moment passed. The clatter of dishes resumed. The man in the booth finally took a bite of toast. It was warm, simple, but he barely tasted it, just because something about that conversation had settled deep in his mind. He glanced once more toward the kitchen. Marcus was already back to work, flipping eggs on the griddle like nothing had happened. Just another morning. Just another quiet act of kindness no one seemed to care about. The man finished his coffee slowly. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. He wrote exactly 3 words. Marcus Reed. He closed the notebook and set it back in his pocket. And for the first time since he walked in, a faint smile crossed his face. Because the truth was, the man who ordered toast that morning wasn't just another customer, and something told him he'd be coming back tomorrow. But the question no one in that diner could have answered was this: why? And what exactly had he come here to see? The question lingered in the quiet corner booth long after the man finished his coffee. Outside, the gray Chicago morning was slowly waking up. A delivery truck rumbled past, splashing water across the curb. The neon glow of the diner sign flickered one last time before the rising daylight swallowed it. Inside Sunrise Corner, the breakfast rush was beginning. The bell above the door chimed again. More customers stepped in, construction workers with dust on their boots, a pair of college students half asleep, a city bus driver still wearing his reflective vest. The waitress refilled mugs without asking. Plates clattered. Grease popped on the griddle. Behind the counter, Marcus Reed moved like someone who had done the same dance 1,000 mornings before. Eggs cracked, toast flipped, coffee poured. The faded yellow hoodie under his apron was stained with flour and butter, but his movements were steady and calm. The man in the booth noticed something strange about him. Marcus never rushed, even when the orders piled up, and even when Rick's voice barked through the kitchen window. "Marcus, table 4 needs hash browns 5 minutes ago." Marcus simply nodded. "Got it." A plate slid across the counter with quiet precision. The waitress grabbed it. "Thanks, Marcus." But not everyone shared that gratitude. At the far end of the counter, one of the construction workers leaned back in his stool, watching Marcus through the kitchen window. "That guy again," he muttered. His friend followed his gaze. "Huh, the charity cook?" They both chuckled. "Yeah," the first one said. "Feeding strays like he's running a soup kitchen." The words weren't loud, but they weren't quiet either. Marcus heard them. Everyone did. The waitress stiffened for a moment, then pretended not to notice. Marcus simply kept flipping eggs. The man in the booth watched carefully. He noticed the way Marcus's shoulders tightened for half a second. Just half a second. Then the tension disappeared, while Marcus placed 2 pancakes on a plate, dusted them with powdered sugar, and slid them toward the counter. "Order up." The laughter faded, but a few customers kept glancing toward him, shaking their heads. The man in the booth leaned forward slightly. He had seen this kind of moment before. The small, casual cruelty people allowed themselves when they believed someone was beneath them. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel and stepped into the dining area with a coffee pot. Yet he stopped beside an elderly woman sitting alone by the window. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," he said gently. Her face lit up. "Well, look at you remembering my name again." Marcus smiled. "Hard to forget someone who tips me with homemade cookies." She laughed softly. "You eat breakfast yet?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet." "Well, don't you dare skip it." "I won't." He topped off her mug and moved down the row of tables. The man in the booth noticed something else, but Marcus treated every single person the same. No rush, no impatience, just quiet attention. Until Rick Dalton's voice cut through the room again. "Marcus!" Rick stepped out of his office, clipboard in hand. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on the empty stool Jamal had been sitting in earlier. Rick's jaw tightened. He walked straight toward Marcus. "Where'd that kid go?" Marcus kept pouring coffee. "He left for school." Rick leaned closer. And what exactly did he eat before he left?" The diner grew quiet again. Marcus didn't answer right away. Rick slapped the clipboard against the counter. "I'm talking to you." Marcus set the coffee pot down slowly. "Eggs, toast, milk." Rick stared at him. "You charge him for it?" Marcus met his eyes calmly. "No." A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rick let out a short laugh. "Unbelievable." He turned toward the room like he was announcing a punchline. Ladies and gentlemen," Rick said loudly, "our very own Marcus Reed is running a charity out of my kitchen again." The construction workers chuckled. One of them clapped mockingly. "Give the man a medal." Marcus stood still. Rick leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think this makes you a hero?" Marcus didn't answer. Rick shook his head. "You're not saving the world, Marcus." He jabbed the clipboard toward the kitchen. "You're costing me money." Marcus finally spoke. "Oh, he was hungry." Rick scoffed. "And?" Marcus looked down at the empty stool Jamal had been sitting on. "And kids shouldn't start the day hungry." For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the college students at the counter muttered quietly, "Man's got a point." Rick shot him a glare. The student quickly looked back at his phone. Rick turned back to Marcus. You're paying for that food, he said flatly. Out of your paycheck. Marcus nodded once. Okay. Rick blinked. Oh, he had expected an argument. Instead, he got silence. Rick sneered. Maybe next time you'll think twice. He turned and walked back toward his office. The tension slowly drained from the room. Forks resumed scraping against plates. Someone turned up the volume on the small radio near the register. Marcus picked up the coffee pot again. The man in the booth watched him carefully. Most people would have been angry, embarrassed. Marcus just kept moving. He stopped at the booth. Need a refill? The man looked up. For the first time, Marcus really noticed him. Sure, the man said. Marcus poured the coffee. Thanks. Marcus nodded politely and started to walk away. Then the man spoke. You feed that kid every morning? Marcus paused. Most mornings. Why? Marcus thought about it for a second. Then he shrugged. Because I can. The answer was so simple it almost sounded like a joke, but there was no humor in Marcus's voice, just quiet truth. The man studied him. Doesn't bother you, he said slowly. What people say about it? Marcus glanced toward the counter where the construction workers were laughing again. Then he looked back at the man. My mama used to say something, Marcus said. What's that? If you've got food on your plate, Marcus said softly, then you've got enough to share. The man sat back in his booth. That sentence stayed with him. Marcus wiped down the table next to him and headed back toward the kitchen. The man watched him disappear through the swinging door. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the small leather notebook. He opened it beneath the table. Under the name Marcus Reed, he wrote another line. Feeds a homeless child every morning. Then he paused. Outside, a police siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Inside the diner, the smell of butter and coffee filled the air, while the man closed the notebook slowly. Because what he had just seen was only the beginning. And something told him that tomorrow morning, Marcus Reed would do it all over again. The question was whether the rest of the world would finally start noticing. The morning rush eventually thinned out at Sunrise Corner. By 9 o'clock, the diner settled into its quieter rhythm. The construction workers had left. The nurse in scrubs paid her check and hurried out into the cold, and sunlight pushed through the front windows now, pale and watery, stretching long reflections across the worn black and white tile floor. The man in the booth remained where he was. His empty plate still held a few crumbs of toast. A fresh cup of coffee steamed slowly in front of him. He wasn't in any hurry. Behind the counter, Marcus Reed wiped down the grill, humming softly to himself. The small radio near the register played an old Motown song, thus its melody crackling faintly through the speakers. The waitress, Linda, stacked clean mugs beside the coffee machine. You gonna sit there all day? She asked the man with a friendly smile. He shrugged. Coffee's good. Well, that's a first. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Most people just grab breakfast and run, she said. You've been here almost 2 hours. Is that a problem? Linda laughed softly. Only if Rick notices. The man glanced toward the office door, while Rick Dalton hadn't come back out since the earlier confrontation. Who owns this place? The man asked casually. Linda poured more coffee into his mug. Some restaurant group out of Chicago, she said. Whitmore something. The man nodded slowly. I've heard of them. Big company, she added, but you wouldn't know it looking around here. He looked around the diner. The cracked vinyl seats, the faded paint near the ceiling, the flickering light above the counter. No, you wouldn't know it. Marcus stepped out from the kitchen carrying a small brown paper bag. He glanced toward the front door, then toward Rick's office. The man in the booth noticed the quick calculation in Marcus's eyes. Marcus walked quietly past the counter, past the register, toward the back hallway. Linda raised an eyebrow. You heading out again? Marcus smiled. Just taking a break. She nodded knowingly. The man in the booth watched him disappear through the rear exit. Something in his expression sharpened. He placed a few bills on the table. Then he stood up. Outside, the air smelled like wet pavement and gasoline. The alley behind the diner was narrow and cluttered with trash bins and delivery crates. A chain-link fence rattled softly in the wind. Marcus stood near the far corner of the parking lot. The brown paper bag hung loosely in his hand. Across the lot, a faded blue sedan sat beneath a broken streetlight. The back seat window was fogged. As Marcus walked toward the car slowly, the man who had ordered toast stepped out of the diner's rear door just in time to see it. He stayed close to the wall, careful not to be seen. Marcus knocked gently on the car window. A moment later, the glass rolled down halfway. A tired woman sat behind the wheel. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun. Dark circles framed her eyes, the kind that came from too many sleepless nights. In the back seat, Jamal leaned forward with a hopeful grin, but Marcus handed the bag through the window. Got you something warm. Jamal peeked inside. His eyes widened. Pancakes! Marcus chuckled. Chef's special. The woman looked embarrassed. You don't have to keep doing this, she said quietly. Marcus shook his head. It's nothing. It's not nothing. Marcus rested his arm on the car door. My mama used to say something, he said. If someone's hungry and you've got food, then the math is pretty simple. The woman smiled weakly. You're a good man, Marcus. He shrugged. I'm just a cook. Jamal started eating immediately, syrup dripping onto the napkin Marcus had tucked into the bag. Marcus watched him for a moment. You get to school okay yesterday? Jamal nodded. Miss Carter gave me a gold star. Look at you. Marcus reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small carton of milk. Almost forgot. Jamal took it like it was treasure. The man by the wall felt a quiet tightening in his chest. When he had seen charity before, he had seen donation drives, corporate pledges, million-dollar press releases. But this was different. There were no cameras here, no announcements, just a man giving away part of his own breakfast. Marcus leaned down slightly so his voice wouldn't carry. You two staying warm enough? The woman hesitated. We manage. Marcus nodded slowly. If you need anything, we know, she said softly. You already help more than anyone else. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, a little uncomfortable with the praise. Well, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Jamal laughed. Marcus smiled back. Behind them, a delivery truck roared past on the street. Marcus checked his watch. Better get back inside before Rick starts counting eggs again. The woman nodded. Thank you. Marcus turned and walked back toward the diner, while he didn't notice the man standing in the shadows beside the wall. But the man noticed everything. The tired car, the thin blanket in the back seat, the way Jamal ate like he hadn't seen pancakes in days. Marcus pushed open the back door and stepped inside. The man stayed where he was for another moment. The wind rustled loose paper along the pavement. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket again. The leather notebook appeared once more, and he flipped to the page where the name was written. Marcus Reed. Under it, he added another line. Shares his own food. Then he paused. Across the parking lot, Jamal waved through the car window as Marcus disappeared inside. The man closed the notebook slowly. He had come to this diner expecting to check a few numbers, a few reports, maybe confirm a suspicion. But instead, he had found something else entirely. Something the spreadsheets had never mentioned. Something far more complicated. Because the numbers said Sunrise Corner was just another underperforming diner. But the man standing in that kitchen, Marcus Reed, seemed to be holding the place together with nothing more than kindness. The man slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Then he walked toward the front of the building again. Inside, Marcus was already back at the grill, flipping eggs, pouring coffee, acting like nothing remarkable had happened at all. And that, yet the man realized, might be the most remarkable part of it. Because tomorrow morning, Marcus Reed would do the same thing again, and the man who ordered toast had just begun to understand why. The diner settled into the slow stretch of late morning, the quiet hour between the breakfast rush and the lunchtime crowd. Outside, the sky over Southside Chicago had turned a dull gray again, clouds rolling in from the lake like a heavy blanket over the city. Inside Sunrise Corner, the smell of coffee and butter hung in the air. Marcus moved behind the counter with steady patience, cleaning the grill and stacking plates. His movements were practiced, calm, the kind of rhythm you learned after years of standing in the same spot before sunrise. Linda wiped down the counter. "You're going to wear that grill out before lunch," she teased. Marcus chuckled. "Better the grill than Rick." Linda glanced toward the office door. Rick Dalton had been quiet for almost an hour, which usually meant he was either doing paperwork or finding something new to complain about. "You hear about the snow coming tonight?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "Chicago weather doesn't need permission." Linda laughed softly. The bell above the door jingled as a couple of customers left. For a moment, the diner was nearly empty. Marcus slipped a rag into the sink and stepped through the swinging kitchen door toward the narrow hallway behind the counter. And the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old tile. At the end was a small break room, barely big enough for 2 chairs and a metal locker. Marcus opened the locker slowly. Inside were only a few things: a folded jacket, a lunch tin, and a photograph taped to the inside door. He stood there for a moment, looking at it. The photo was old, the edges worn soft from time. A woman stood in front of a small apartment building, her arm wrapped around a younger version of Marcus. But the boy in the picture couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was smiling wide, missing 2 front teeth. The woman beside him looked proud, strong, tired in the way mothers often looked when they worked 2 jobs and still managed to smile for their kids. Marcus reached up and touched the corner of the photo. "My mama," he murmured softly. Footsteps echoed faintly from the diner. Marcus leaned against the locker. For a moment, the sounds of the kitchen faded away. What the years peeled back. He remembered nights in a one-room apartment with broken heating. Remembered sitting at the kitchen table while his mother stretched 1 box of pasta across 3 meals. Remembered the nights when the power went out, and she lit candles like it was a celebration instead of a problem. She had always said the same thing when things got hard. "If you've got enough to eat, baby," she'd say, "then you've got enough to share." Marcus closed the locker gently. Once the break room door creaked open, the man who ordered toast stood in the doorway. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Oh, sorry," the man said quickly. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Marcus straightened. "It's all right." The man nodded toward the lockers. "Break room?" "Something like that." The man studied him for a moment. "You ever sit down?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Not during breakfast." The man leaned against the wall. "I saw you outside earlier." Marcus froze just slightly. "With the kid," the man added. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Jamal." "Jamal," the man repeated. A moment of quiet passed. "You help them every day?" the man asked. Marcus shrugged. "Most days." "That must get expensive." Marcus chuckled softly. "Eggs and toast don't cost much." "But it adds up." Marcus thought about that. "Maybe," he said. Then he looked down at the photo still in his hand. "But going hungry adds up too." The man noticed the picture. Your family?" "My mama." Marcus leaned against the locker. "She used to work 2 jobs," he said. "Cleaned offices at night, waitressed during the day." The man listened quietly. She always made sure I ate before she did, Marcus continued, even when there wasn't much to go around. The diner radio crackled faintly through the wall. And when someone else needed help? The man asked. Marcus smiled. She'd say the same thing every time. He looked up. If you've got food on your plate, then somebody else probably needs it too. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched Marcus carefully. Life treat you all right since then? He asked. Marcus laughed under his breath. Well, I've been fired from 4 kitchens. 4? Marcus nodded. Too slow for one. Too soft for another. Too soft? Marcus shrugged. Some places don't like cooks giving food away. The man looked toward the diner. And this place? Marcus hesitated, and then he smiled in that quiet, careful way. This place lets me cook. Rick's voice suddenly barked through the hallway. Marcus! Marcus sighed. Duty calls. He pushed the locker shut and walked back toward the kitchen. The man followed a few steps behind. When they stepped back into the diner, Rick Dalton was standing at the counter flipping through receipts. Rick glanced up. There you are. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel. What's up? Rick held up a sheet of paper. Well, food inventory's off again. Marcus didn't say anything. Rick narrowed his eyes. You want to explain why? Marcus stayed calm. Probably miscounted. Rick leaned closer. I don't miscount. The tension returned to the room like a sudden drop in temperature. The man who ordered toast stood quietly behind them, observing. Rick tapped the paper against the counter. Eggs missing. He flipped the page. Milk too. Marcus didn't respond. Rick's voice sharpened. You think I'm stupid? Linda looked down at the coffee machine. Nobody spoke. Rick leaned closer. You feeding that kid again? Marcus met his eyes. Yes. The word landed in the silence like a stone in water. Rick shook his head slowly. You're unbelievable. He turned and pointed toward the kitchen. Next time it comes out of your check. Marcus nodded once. Okay. Rick stared at him for a moment longer, almost confused by the lack of resistance, and then he stormed back toward his office. The diner slowly breathed again. Linda exhaled. Marcus picked up the spatula and returned to the grill like nothing had happened. The man who ordered toast watched him carefully. Not angry, not embarrassed, just steady, like a man who had already made peace with the cost of kindness. The man slid back into his booth, the same view of the kitchen window. Linda appeared beside him. You want more toast? He smiled faintly. Why not? She scribbled the order. You really like toast. The man looked toward Marcus again. I think I like the view. Linda followed his gaze. Marcus flipped eggs, the grill sizzling beneath his hands. She shook her head. That man's too good for this place. The customer didn't answer, but he reached into his coat pocket again. The leather notebook appeared. He wrote another line beneath Marcus Reed. Gives even when it costs him. Then he closed the notebook, and stared through the kitchen window. Because something about Marcus Reed didn't fit the reports he had read. Not the profit margins, not the staffing numbers, not the quiet warnings he'd been hearing from corporate auditors. And the more he watched, the more certain he became. Something at Sunrise Corner was broken. But it wasn't Marcus Reed. The late morning light faded behind a layer of heavy clouds, and the diner grew dimmer even before the lunch crowd arrived. And the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow across the chrome counters and cracked vinyl booths. Marcus stood at the grill, flipping a row of burgers as the first lunchtime customers trickled in. The sizzling meat filled the room with a rich, smoky smell. Across the diner, the man who had ordered toast remained in the same booth. His second plate of toast sat half-finished. His eyes were fixed on the kitchen window. He wasn't watching the food. What, he was watching Marcus. Rick Dalton burst out of his office again, holding the same inventory sheet from earlier. His face looked red now. Not just annoyed, angry. "Marcus," Rick said sharply. Marcus turned. "Yes?" Rick slapped the paper against the counter. "We're missing 6 eggs." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel. "I told you, I'll cover it." Rick scoffed loudly. "That's not the point." Several customers looked up from their meals. Rick raised his voice. "Oh, you think this is your kitchen?" Marcus stayed calm. "No." Rick leaned closer. "Because it sure looks like you're running things your way." Marcus didn't answer. Rick jabbed his finger toward the back door. "That kid again this morning?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Rick laughed in disbelief. "Unreal." The construction workers from earlier were back, sitting at the counter again. One of them leaned over to his friend. "Here we go." Rick's voice echoed through the diner. "You giving away company food like you're some kind of saint." Marcus kept his eyes steady. He was hungry. Rick slammed the clipboard on the counter. "And now you're costing me money." Marcus glanced toward the customers, then back to Rick. "I said I'll pay for it." Rick folded his arms. "Oh, you will." He reached behind the counter and grabbed a calculator. The small machine beeped as he punched in numbers. Eggs, milk, bread. He turned the screen toward Marcus. $7.40. Marcus reached into his pocket without hesitation. He pulled out a few folded bills. Rick watched carefully. Marcus placed the money on the counter. Rick didn't pick it up. Instead, he pushed the calculator aside. "Actually," Rick said slowly, "we're doing this differently." Marcus frowned slightly. "How?" Rick leaned forward. "You don't just pay for the food." He tapped the inventory sheet. "You pay a penalty." The diner went quiet again, but Marcus blinked. "A penalty?" Rick nodded. $15. A murmur moved through the room. One of the college students at the corner booth whispered, "That's messed up." Rick ignored him. Marcus looked down at the money in his hand. Then he reached into his other pocket. More crumpled bills, loose coins. He counted slowly. Linda watched from the coffee station, her expression tightening. Marcus placed the money on the counter. Rick scooped it up immediately. "Good," he said. But Marcus turned back to the grill. The moment passed. But something had shifted. The man in the booth felt it. The room felt heavier now, like the air itself had thickened. Rick leaned against the counter and looked around the diner. "You see what happens," he said loudly, "when people start thinking rules don't apply to them." Marcus kept cooking. Rick smirked. "Kindness doesn't pay rent." The construction workers laughed again, but the sound felt weaker this time, as Marcus slid a plate across the counter. "Order up." Rick shook his head. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus didn't answer. "You think you're better than everyone else." Marcus looked up. "No." Rick pointed toward the back door. "You feed every sad story that walks in here." Marcus rested both hands on the counter. "My problem," he said quietly, "is seeing a kid hungry." Rick rolled his eyes. "Oh, your problem is you don't understand business." The man in the booth leaned forward slightly. Rick turned and pointed toward the kitchen. "This diner runs on numbers." He tapped the inventory sheet again. "Not feelings." Marcus held his gaze. "People aren't numbers." Rick laughed. "They are when they're costing you money." For a moment, the entire diner seemed to freeze. Forks paused. Coffee mugs hovered mid-air. Marcus looked down at the grill. The burgers were ready, and he flipped them onto plates. Rick shook his head. "You keep this up, Marcus." He let the sentence hang. Marcus didn't look up. Rick leaned closer. "You won't be working here much longer." The words hung in the air like a warning. Then Rick walked back toward his office. The door slammed shut behind him. The noise echoed through the diner. Marcus stood still for a moment. Then he picked up the spatula again. "Order up," he said calmly. Linda grabbed the plates. You okay?" she whispered. Marcus smiled faintly. "I've had worse bosses." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have to pay for feeding a kid." Marcus shrugged. "It's just money." Linda glanced toward the office. Still, Marcus looked toward the back door where Jamal had left earlier. "Kids gotta eat." Linda sighed. "You're too good for this place." Marcus chuckled. "Don't tell Rick that." Across the room, the man who ordered toast sat very still, while he had watched the entire exchange. Every word, every dollar counted, every laugh. He reached into his coat pocket again. The leather notebook appeared. He opened it slowly. Under Marcus Reed, he wrote one more line. "Pays the price for kindness." Then he paused. His pen hovered above the page, because now something else was beginning to form in his mind. A question. A very serious question. And if Marcus Reed was willing to lose money just to feed a child, what else was happening inside Sunrise Corner that nobody else could see? The man closed the notebook. Outside the window, the sky darkened again. The wind picked up, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the city. A storm was coming, and when it arrived, Sunrise Corner would never be the same again. But storms in Chicago rarely begin with thunder. They begin quietly. The sky darkens a little earlier than expected. Yet the wind carries the smell of rain through the streets. People move a little faster, glancing upward like they know something is coming. Inside Sunrise Corner, the afternoon had slowed to a crawl. The lunch rush had passed. Plates were stacked neatly near the sink. The grill cooled beneath a thin sheen of grease and heat. Marcus Reed wiped down the counter in long, steady strokes. The radio played softly again, an old soul song humming through the speakers. But Linda leaned against the coffee station, counting tips into a small glass jar. "You heading out after this shift?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah." "Back tomorrow?" Marcus smiled. "Same as always." She looked at him for a moment. "You ever think about working somewhere else?" Marcus laughed under his breath. "Who's hiring cooks that give away breakfast?" Linda didn't laugh. "I'm serious." Marcus rinsed the rag in the sink. "Places like this are everywhere." He wrung the rag dry. But people like Jamal aren't." Linda opened her mouth to reply. Then the bell above the door rang again. The same man stepped inside. The baseball cap, the quiet eyes, the same calm walk. Marcus noticed him this time. "Back again?" Marcus said. The man slid into the same booth. "Looks that way." Linda poured coffee without asking. "You must really like our toast." The man smiled faintly. "I'm starting to." Marcus returned to the grill, and even though there were only 2 orders waiting. Outside, the wind picked up. The clouds thickened into a heavy gray blanket across the city. The man in the booth watched everything, every movement, every exchange. Marcus flipping eggs, Linda greeting customers, Rick pacing in and out of his office like a man guarding something no one else could see. The diner door opened again. 2 teenagers walked in, shaking rain from their jackets. "Just coffee," one of them said, but Marcus poured it without hesitation. "No charge," he said quietly. The boys blinked. "You sure?" Marcus nodded. "Stay warm." Rick stepped out of his office just in time to hear it. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. The man in the booth noticed that too. Rick was watching Marcus more carefully now, like a man waiting for the next mistake. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Marcus stepped out from behind the counter with a tray. and he carried 2 bowls of soup toward the far booth, where an elderly man sat hunched in a thick winter coat. "Here you go, Mr. Callahan." The old man blinked up at him. "I didn't order soup." Marcus smiled. "You look cold." The old man's eyes softened. "Bless you, son." The man in the booth leaned back slightly. He had been watching for 3 days now. 3 mornings, 3 afternoons, 3 quiet observations. And Marcus Reed had done the same thing every day. Feed someone, or help someone, share something. Always quietly. Always without asking for anything back. The man pulled the leather notebook from his pocket again. The page beneath Marcus Reed was nearly full now. Feeds the hungry, pays out of pocket, gives quietly. He added another line. Doesn't know anyone is watching. He closed the notebook. Linda approached the booth. "You want the usual?" He nodded. "Toast." She shook her head with a smile. "Oh, you're the easiest customer I've got." Marcus glanced over his shoulder. "You should try the pancakes." The man chuckled. "Maybe tomorrow." Marcus returned to the grill. The wind rattled the windows. Rain began tapping lightly against the glass. Rick stood near the counter, arms folded. He stared at Marcus. The man in the booth noticed something else now. Rick wasn't just irritated. He was suspicious. And suspicion had a way of turning small problems into big ones. And the rain outside intensified. Streetlights flickered on even though it was only late afternoon. Cars moved faster through the wet streets. Marcus finished cooking the toast and placed the plate in front of the man. "Here you go." The man looked up. "Thanks." Marcus nodded and turned away, but the man spoke again. "Marcus?" Marcus paused. "Yeah? You ever get tired?" Marcus laughed softly. "Of cooking? Of helping everyone?" Marcus thought about it for a moment, and then he shrugged. "Not really." "Why not?" Marcus looked toward the front window where rain streaked across the glass. "When you've been the one needing help," he said quietly, "you remember what it feels like." The man studied him carefully. "You needed help once?" Marcus smiled faintly. "More than once." Rick slammed a cabinet door behind the counter. The sound cracked through the room like a warning. Marcus glanced toward the office. Looks like I'd better get back to work." He walked away again. The man in the booth sat quietly with his toast. The storm outside thickened. Rain poured harder now. Thunder rolled closer. And Rick Dalton's eyes never left Marcus Reed. Because something about Marcus's kindness had started to look less like generosity and more like defiance. The man who ordered toast noticed that too. And deep down, he knew something else. Storms didn't just change the weather. Well, sometimes they changed people. Sometimes they revealed what had been hidden. And tonight, when the rain finally came down hard enough, someone inside Sunrise Corner was going to break. The only question was who? Marcus Reed, or the man who had been watching him all along. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. Rain hammered the streets of South Side Chicago like 1,000 tiny fists against the pavement. Headlights blurred through the water-streaked windows of Sunrise Corner, turning the diner into a glowing island in the middle of a gray, restless night. Inside, the dinner rush had died down early. Bad weather always did that. Only a few customers remained scattered across the booths, nursing coffee while the wind rattled the old glass panes. Marcus stood behind the grill, quietly finishing the last order of the night. The smell of toasted bread filled the kitchen again. Across the room, the man in the baseball cap watched him. Still. Silent. Well, the same way he had for days. Rick Dalton stormed out of his office, slamming the door behind him. "All right," he barked. "We're closing early." Linda glanced up. "It's only 8. Rick grabbed a stack of receipts. "And the storm's getting worse." Marcus flipped the final slice of toast. Couple people still eating. Rick didn't care. They can finish and leave. The thunder outside rolled deeper now, echoing across the block, and a flash of lightning lit the diner windows for a split second. The room felt colder. Marcus plated the toast and slid it across the counter. Rick watched him again. Then Rick noticed something. The back door. It creaked open slightly under a gust of wind. Rain blew through the small gap. Marcus frowned. I thought I locked that. He walked toward the back hallway. The man in the booth leaned forward slightly. The kitchen lights flickered as Marcus pushed the door open wider. And there, curled beside the dumpster in the alley, was Jamal. The small boy's hoodie was soaked. His knees were pulled to his chest. He was shivering. Marcus stepped outside immediately. Hey. The boy looked up slowly. I didn't mean to bother you, Jamal whispered. Marcus crouched beside him. You'll freeze out here. Jamal shook his head. I'm okay. Marcus knew that wasn't true. Come inside. The boy hesitated. The manager. I'll deal with Rick. Marcus held out his hand. For a moment, the boy just stared at it. Then he slowly took it. Inside the diner, Linda saw them first. Oh no. Jamal stepped inside carefully, water dripping from his clothes onto the tile floor. Rick turned around, and his expression changed instantly. Marcus? The word came out cold. Marcus placed a towel around Jamal's shoulders. He was outside in the storm. Rick's voice rose. And now he's inside. Marcus didn't back down. He's a kid. Rick stepped forward. This is not a shelter. Marcus grabbed a bowl from the counter. I'll feed him quick, then he'll go. Rick laughed bitterly. You just don't learn, do you? The room had gone silent. The few customers left watched the scene carefully. Marcus filled the bowl with hot soup. Steam rose into the cool diner air. He placed it in front of Jamal. Eat. The boy's hands trembled as he held the spoon. But Rick slapped the counter loudly. That's it. Marcus looked up slowly. You're done. The words echoed in the diner. Linda gasped. Rick! Rick pointed toward the door. You're fired. The thunder outside crashed louder now. Rain poured down the windows like sheets of glass. Marcus didn't move at first. Jamal froze. I'm sorry, the boy whispered. Marcus shook his head gently. This ain't your fault. Rick grabbed Marcus's apron and tossed it onto the counter. Oh, you can't run a business on charity. Marcus untied the apron calmly. He folded it neatly and placed it beside the register. The silence in the diner felt heavy now. Linda's eyes filled with tears. You're really doing this? Rick didn't answer. Marcus turned toward Jamal. The boy still clutched the bowl of soup. You finish eating, Marcus said softly. Jamal looked up. But where are you going? Marcus smiled. Home. He grabbed his worn jacket from the hook near the door. But the man in the baseball cap stood up slowly from his booth. Rick noticed him. You need something? The man placed cash on the table. No. He paused. Then he looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Just watching. Marcus pushed open the front door. Cold rain blew inside immediately. The storm swallowed the streetlights outside. Marcus stepped into it without hesitation. The door closed behind him. Jamal stared at the empty doorway. The bowl of soup trembled in his hands. Inside Sunrise Corner, something deeper than the weather had just broken. Rick Dalton thought he had solved a problem. But the man who had ordered toast knew something Rick didn't. Because the man in the baseball cap wasn't just a customer, and Marcus Reed had just done something very important. Something that couldn't be measured in eggs, or bread, or inventory sheets. The man picked up his coat and walked slowly toward the door. Outside, well, the storm roared through the streets of Chicago, and somewhere inside that rain, Marcus Reed was walking home, unemployed, cold, but still the same man he had been that morning, kind. The man in the baseball cap stepped out into the storm after him, because now it was finally time to stop watching. Rain struck the pavement in wild, uneven sheets, bouncing off the cracked sidewalks of South Side Chicago. The streetlights along 63rd Street flickered in the wind, but casting pale circles of light that blurred under the downpour. Marcus Reed walked through the storm without rushing. His jacket was already soaked through. Water dripped from the brim of his hood, running down his face and neck. But he didn't seem to notice. Losing a job hurt, but not the way people thought. It wasn't the money first. It was the quiet feeling of being pushed aside, like the good you tried to do had no place in the world. Marcus kept walking. Behind him, the door of Sunrise Corner opened again. The man in the baseball cap stepped out into the rain. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching Marcus move down the empty street. Then he followed. Not too close, just enough to keep him in sight. The storm swallowed most of the city noise. Cars moved slowly through flooded intersections. Store signs flickered as gusts of wind pushed rain against their windows. Marcus stopped beneath a bus stop shelter. Yet the small plastic roof rattled above him. He leaned against the metal bench and wiped rain from his face. A few seconds later, the man in the baseball cap stepped under the shelter too. Marcus glanced up. "You again." The man smiled faintly. "Looks like we're both caught in the same storm." Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah." The rain pounded harder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Cars splashed through puddles along the street. The man looked at Marcus. "You all right?" Marcus shrugged. "I've been worse. You just lost your job." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Jobs come and go." The man studied him carefully. "You don't seem angry." Marcus thought about that. "Rick runs his diner the way he wants." "And you?" Marcus looked out at the empty road. "I do what lets me sleep at night." The man nodded slowly. "That kid, Jamal." Marcus smiled faintly. "He reminds me of someone." "Who?" Marcus took a deep breath. Me." The rain softened slightly now, turning into a steady rhythm against the shelter roof. The man leaned back against the metal pole. "You grew up around here?" Marcus nodded. "Couple blocks south." "Tough neighborhood." Marcus laughed quietly. "That's one way to say it." The man watched the street for a moment. "Ever think about leaving?" Marcus shook his head. "Someone's got to stay." Lightning flashed across the sky. For a brief second, the street lit up like daylight. But Marcus noticed something. The man's coat. It wasn't cheap. Neither were his shoes. And the leather notebook sticking slightly from his pocket. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You sure you belong in this part of town?" The man chuckled. "I've been told that before." "Yeah?" "More than once." Marcus crossed his arms. "So what brings you to Sunrise Corner every day?" The man looked down at the rain sliding off the edge of the shelter. "I was looking for something." "Did you find it?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket. The leather notebook appeared again. Marcus noticed the worn edges, the careful handwriting inside. "You writing a story or something?" The man smiled. "Something like that." He closed the notebook. Then he took off the baseball cap. For the first time, Marcus saw his face clearly under the streetlight. The man's expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Marcus," he said quietly. "Yeah?" "My name is Daniel Whitmore." Marcus frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar, but the storm, the long shift, the exhaustion. It all blurred together. "Okay," Marcus said. Daniel Whitmore looked directly at him. "I own Sunrise Corner." Marcus blinked. For a second, he thought he had misheard. "You what?" Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Along with 47 other diners across Illinois." Marcus stared. "You're joking." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not." Thunder rolled again across the sky. Marcus let out a slow breath. "So what? This whole week?" Daniel nodded. "I've been working undercover." Marcus laughed once in disbelief. "You're the boss?" Daniel nodded again. "I needed to see how things really worked." Marcus looked back toward the direction of the diner. "And you saw Rick fire me?" Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Yes." Rain dripped steadily from the shelter roof, as Marcus leaned back against the bench. "Well," he shrugged, "that's life." Daniel watched him carefully. "You don't seem surprised." Marcus smiled. "I've had bosses like Rick before." Daniel studied his face. "You fed that boy knowing you might lose your job." Marcus shrugged again. "He needed food." Daniel's voice lowered slightly. "Most people wouldn't risk their paycheck for that." Marcus looked out at the rain-soaked street. Most people forgot what it feels like to be hungry." Silence filled the bus stop. The storm slowly began to fade. Daniel Whitmore reached into his coat pocket again. This time he pulled out a business card. He handed it to Marcus. Marcus took it carefully. Under the streetlight, the words were clear. Daniel Whitmore, founder and CEO, Whitmore Hospitality Group. Marcus exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" Daniel looked down the empty street. "Now," he said, "we fix what's broken." Marcus tilted his head. "Meaning?" Daniel put the baseball cap back on. "Tomorrow morning." Marcus waited. Daniel met his eyes again. "Come back to Sunrise Corner." Marcus frowned. "Rick fired me." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yes." He turned toward the street. "But Rick doesn't run the company." Daniel stepped into the rain again, and as he walked away, his final words carried softly through the fading storm. "I do." Marcus stood beneath the shelter and staring down at the business card in his hand. For the first time that night, the storm didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Marcus Reed stood under the bus stop shelter long after Daniel Whitmore had disappeared into the rain. The street had gone quiet again. The storm slowly drifted east, leaving behind puddles that reflected the dull orange glow of the streetlights. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed briefly and faded into the distance. Marcus turned the business card over in his hands. Daniel Whitmore, founder and CEO. The letters looked strange against the worn skin of his palm, like they belonged to another world. He slipped the card into his pocket and started walking home. Sleep didn't come easy that night, not because Marcus was excited, but because he didn't quite know what to believe. Morning arrived cold and gray. The streets of Southside Chicago were still damp from the storm, when water dripped from the edges of storefront awnings. Delivery trucks rolled past with low engines rumbling through the quiet morning. Marcus stood across the street from Sunrise Corner. The diner looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Same faded red sign, same cracked front window, same smell of coffee drifting through the open door. If anything had changed, the building itself hadn't noticed. Marcus hesitated. He almost turned around. But then he remembered the boy. Jamal had curled in the rain beside the dumpster. Marcus took a deep breath. Then he crossed the street. The bell above the diner door rang softly as he stepped inside. The room was already busy, but something felt different. Linda stood behind the counter. When she saw Marcus, her eyes widened. "Marcus?" He gave a small wave. Morning. She hurried toward him. What are you doing here? Marcus scratched the back of his neck. Someone told me to come back. Linda blinked. Oh, Rick's gonna lose his mind. Almost as if summoned, Rick Dalton stepped out of his office. He froze the moment he saw Marcus. You. Marcus nodded calmly. Me. Rick's face turned red instantly. I fired you. Marcus shrugged. Yeah. Rick marched across the floor. Then why are you standing in my diner? Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the door. Right on time. The bell rang again. The entire diner seemed to pause as a black sedan pulled up outside. Well, the door opened. Daniel Whitmore stepped inside. Without the baseball cap. Without the disguise. His presence changed the room instantly. He wore a dark coat now, pressed and clean. The kind of coat people noticed without knowing why. Rick stopped mid-sentence. Sir? Daniel looked around the diner slowly. Customers whispered quietly to each other. Linda's eyes widened. Marcus stood quietly near the counter. Daniel's voice was calm. Good morning. Rick straightened his shirt. What can I do for you? Daniel stepped toward the counter. I'm here about your staff. Rick smiled nervously. Oh, everything's running fine. Daniel turned his gaze toward Marcus. Is it? Rick followed his eyes. His smile faded. That man doesn't work here anymore. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why not? Rick cleared his throat. He violated company policy. Which policy? Rick hesitated. Unauthorized food distribution. A few customers exchanged confused looks, as Daniel nodded slowly. You mean feeding a hungry child? Rick stiffened. Sir, we have inventory rules. Daniel stepped closer. And penalties? Rick blinked. What? Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. I heard you charged him $15. Rick's face paled. Linda looked at Marcus. Marcus said nothing. Daniel placed both hands on the counter. I've spent the past 4 days inside this diner. Rick's mouth opened, but no words came out. Daniel continued calmly. I've watched how this place runs. He glanced around the room. How employees are treated. Rick's hands began to tremble. Daniel turned toward Marcus. And how kindness is punished. The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the coffee machines seemed quieter. Daniel faced Rick again. You fired the best employee in this building. Rick stammered. I didn't know. Daniel cut him off. That I owned the company? Rick swallowed hard. Oh, yes, sir. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the leather notebook. He opened it. Pages filled with notes, dates, observations, names. Rick stared at it like it was a courtroom file. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. Effective immediately, he said calmly. You are no longer the manager of Sunrise Corner. Rick's face went pale. You can't. Daniel's voice remained steady. I already did. Rick looked around the diner desperately, but no one spoke. But Linda folded her arms. Several customers nodded quietly. Daniel turned to Marcus. Mr. Reed? Marcus stepped forward. Yes, sir. Daniel smiled faintly. Would you like your job back? Marcus thought about it for exactly 1 second. Yes. Daniel nodded. Good. Then he said something that stunned the entire room. Because starting today, he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You're running this diner. The room exploded into whispers. Rick staggered back. Oh, what? Marcus blinked in disbelief. Running it? Daniel nodded. You already understand the most important part of this business. Marcus frowned slightly. And that is? Daniel looked around the room. At the people. He gestured toward the booths. The customers. toward the kitchen, the staff, then toward the door, and the kid outside who needed soup. Marcus stared at him. Daniel smiled again. Sunrise Corner needs a manager who remembers what hunger feels like. The diner grew quiet again, but this time, it was the quiet of something new beginning. For a few long seconds, nobody inside Sunrise Corner moved. The sound of the coffee machine dripping into a glass pot echoed softly through the diner. Marcus Reed stood frozen beside the counter, Daniel Whitmore's hand still resting on his shoulder. Manager. The word felt strange, heavy, not like a coat that didn't quite belong to him yet. Rick Dalton looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. You're serious? Rick stammered. Daniel Whitmore turned slowly toward him. I'm always serious. Rick pointed toward Marcus, as if the idea itself were ridiculous. Him? Marcus lowered his eyes slightly. Daniel answered calmly. Yes. Rick laughed once, but the sound came out thin. He's a cook. Daniel folded his hands in front of him. And you were a manager? Rick's smile faded. Daniel continued. One of you understands people. He glanced toward the customers sitting quietly in the booths. The other understands spreadsheets. Rick looked around the diner again, hoping someone might defend him. No one did. Linda leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. One of the construction workers lifted his coffee cup slowly and said under his breath, "About time." Rick's shoulders sagged. "Oh, you're making a mistake." Daniel shook his head. I already watched the mistake for 4 days. Rick grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair near the office. You'll regret this. Daniel didn't react. Rick walked toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back at Marcus. This place will eat you alive. Marcus met his eyes calmly. Maybe. Rick pushed the door open and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The bell above the door rang one last time behind him. Oh, and then he was gone. Inside the diner, the room felt different, like a window had opened somewhere. Daniel turned toward Marcus. Well, he said quietly. That was the easy part. Marcus blinked. That was the easy part. Daniel smiled faintly. Running a diner is harder than firing a bad manager. Marcus laughed softly. I believe that. Daniel stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen. Go ahead. Marcus frowned. Go ahead what? Daniel nodded toward the grill. Oh, start your first shift. Marcus looked around the room. The same diner, the same grill, the same cracked tile floor. But somehow everything had changed. He walked behind the counter slowly. Linda handed him an apron. Manager needs this, she said with a grin. Marcus stared at it. This still smells like onions. Linda laughed. That's the official smell of Sunrise Corner. Marcus tied the apron around his waist. The movement felt familiar, comforting, and he stepped to the grill and flipped on the burners. Blue flames jumped to life. Daniel took a seat at the counter this time, not in the corner booth. Linda poured him a cup of coffee. Toast? She asked. Daniel smiled. You know me too well. Marcus heard that and shook his head. You're going to have to try pancakes eventually. Daniel raised an eyebrow. We'll see. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Coffee cups clinked. Forks scraped plates. And the quiet hum of morning conversation filled the room again. But there was a new energy beneath it. Like everyone understood something important had happened. Marcus placed a plate of fresh toast in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at it thoughtfully. You know, he said, this might be the most expensive toast I've ever ordered. Marcus laughed. Hope it's worth it. Daniel took a bite, then nodded. Definitely. A small figure appeared in the doorway. Jamal. Yet his hoodie was still damp from the night before. He stood there nervously, unsure if he was welcome. Marcus spotted him immediately. "Hey." Jamal stepped inside slowly. "Am I in trouble?" Marcus shook his head. "Not today." Linda slid a stool out from the counter. "Sit down." The boy climbed onto it carefully. Marcus placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. Jamal's eyes widened. "For me?" Marcus nodded. "Oh, manager's special." Jamal looked at the food like it was a treasure. Daniel watched the moment quietly. Then he leaned toward Marcus. "You realize something." Marcus glanced over. "What's that?" Daniel gestured toward the boy. "That's the real reason this diner works." Marcus followed his gaze. Jamal eating quickly, smiling between bites. Marcus nodded. "Yeah." Outside the window, the clouds finally began to break apart. Thin sunlight slipped through the gray sky. The light hit the front windows of Sunrise Corner and spilled across the floor. Daniel finished his coffee. "You're going to do well here." Marcus wiped the counter. "I'll try." Daniel stood up. "No." He placed a few bills beside the plate. "You already did." Marcus looked up. Daniel paused at the door. "One more thing." Marcus waited. Daniel nodded toward Jamal. "Don't stop doing what got you here." Marcus smiled softly. "I won't." Daniel stepped outside into the morning light. The bell above the door rang behind him. Marcus looked around the diner, the same place he had walked into every morning for years. But now, it felt like the first day of something entirely different. And for the first time in a long time, Sunrise Corner finally lived up to its name. Morning sunlight stretched across the diner floor like warm honey, when slipping through the tall front windows and catching the steam rising from fresh coffee. The place felt alive. Not just busy, alive. Customers filled the booths earlier than usual. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like this. People had heard something had happened the night before. Nobody knew the whole story, but everyone felt the shift. Marcus Reed stood behind the grill, flipping eggs with the same steady rhythm he had used for years. Except now, as the apron tied around his waist meant something different. Manager. The word still felt strange in his mind. Linda slid 2 plates across the counter. "Table 3, she said. Marcus nodded. The construction workers from earlier in the week sat there again. One of them lifted his coffee cup toward Marcus. "Boss man." Marcus laughed. "Don't start." "You earned it," the man replied. Across the room, Jamal sat quietly at the corner stool, but finishing another plate of pancakes Marcus had made. His eyes moved around the diner like he still couldn't believe he was allowed to be there. Marcus leaned toward him. "You heading to school today?" Jamal nodded. "Yeah." "Good." Marcus tapped the counter. "Finish that milk." The boy obeyed quickly. Outside, the city moved through its usual morning rush. Buses roared past. People hurried along sidewalks with coats pulled tight against the lingering chill. But inside Sunrise Corner, the mood felt lighter than it had in years. The door opened again. Linda glanced up and froze. 3 people stepped inside. 2 men in dark suits, and Daniel Whitmore. Marcus noticed them immediately. Daniel didn't wear the baseball cap today. He didn't need to. The entire diner seemed to recognize him instantly now. Conversations slowed. Forks paused. Linda whispered under her breath, "Well, that's new." Daniel walked toward the counter calmly. "Morning." "Oh, Marcus." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel. "Morning." Daniel glanced around the diner with a satisfied look. "Busy." Marcus nodded. "Word gets around." Daniel smiled. "It will today." Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel gestured toward the two men beside him. They're from the company office. Marcus blinked. Office? Daniel nodded. And a local news station is coming in about an hour. The entire counter went silent. Linda nearly dropped the coffee pot. News? Marcus stared at him. For what? Daniel leaned casually against the counter. For you. Marcus shook his head immediately. No. Daniel chuckled. You don't get a vote. Marcus crossed his arms. I'm just cooking breakfast. Daniel pointed toward the grill. That's exactly why they're coming. Linda looked between them. What's going on? Daniel's voice softened slightly. Sometimes, he said, people need to see what kindness looks like in real life. Marcus shook his head again. You don't need cameras for that. Daniel smiled. Maybe not. He glanced toward Jamal. But the world does. Jamal froze mid-bite when he realized they were looking at him. Daniel crouched beside the stool. Hey there. Jamal nodded nervously. Hi. Daniel held out his hand. I'm Daniel. The boy shook it carefully. Marcus watched the moment quietly. Daniel turned back toward him. You know what the reporters asked when I told them the story? Marcus sighed. What? Daniel leaned forward. They asked if it was true. Marcus frowned. What part? Daniel's voice stayed calm. That a cook paid his own money to feed a hungry kid. Marcus shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. Daniel shook his head. That's where you're wrong. He gestured around the diner. People expect kindness to come from big speeches. He pointed toward Marcus. But sometimes it comes from a man flipping eggs. The front door opened again. A woman holding a camera stepped inside. Behind her came another man carrying a microphone. The diner buzzed with whispers. Linda leaned toward Marcus. You ready for this? Marcus looked at the grill, then at Jamal, then back at the crowd of customers quietly watching. He took a slow breath. I guess I am. The reporter approached Daniel first. Mr. Whitmore? Daniel nodded. Morning. She looked around the diner. This is where it happened? Daniel smiled. Every day. The camera turned toward Marcus. For a second, Marcus felt the same nerves he had felt walking into a job interview years ago. But then Jamal spoke quietly from the stool. He's the nicest person here. The camera turned toward the boy. What do you mean? The reporter asked gently. Jamal swallowed. When it was raining, he gave me soup. The diner fell silent again. The reporter looked back at Marcus. Why? Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. Kid was hungry. That's it? Marcus nodded. That's it. The reporter lowered the microphone slowly. Daniel Whitmore smiled quietly behind her. Because that simple answer, 3 small words, was exactly why this story mattered. The camera light blinked red. Recording. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Reed's name began traveling far beyond the streets of Southside Chicago. But it didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden explosion of cameras or crowds flooding the diner. Instead, it started quietly. The same way Marcus had always done things. The reporter's story aired that evening on a local Chicago station. A short segment at first, just a few minutes near the end of the broadcast. But something about it felt different. The footage showed Sunrise Corner exactly as it was. The cracked vinyl booths, the humming coffee machine, or the small boy in a faded hoodie eating pancakes at the counter. And behind the grill, a tall man with tired eyes and a calm voice saying only 3 simple words. Kid was hungry. By the next morning, the story had spread. Not just across Chicago, across the internet. Phones buzzed. Messages traveled. Clips of the interview appeared on social media feeds, shared by people who had never even heard of Southside Chicago. Some called Marcus a hero. Others simply called him decent. Once inside Sunrise Corner, Marcus was flipping eggs again. The diner looked busier than it had in years. Customers lined up outside the door before sunrise. Linda poured coffee so fast she barely had time to breathe. "Marcus," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Yeah? You see the line outside?" Marcus glanced through the window. People stood along the sidewalk, some holding phones, others just curious. "Guess folks like breakfast," Marcus said. Linda laughed. "Oh, that's not why they're here." Jamal sat at his usual stool again, swinging his legs while finishing a stack of pancakes. "Can I come here after school again?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "Always." Daniel Whitmore entered the diner quietly that morning. No reporters this time. No suits. Just the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning. He took his usual seat at the counter. Linda poured coffee without asking. "You created a monster," she said playfully. Daniel smiled. "Oh, not me." He nodded toward Marcus. "He did." Marcus placed a plate of toast in front of him. "You sure about that?" Daniel looked around the room. Customers laughing. Neighbors greeting each other. Jamal finishing his breakfast with a grin. Daniel nodded. "Very sure." A woman approached the counter nervously. "Excuse me," she said. Marcus looked up. "Yes, ma'am?" She held out a small envelope. "I saw the story." Marcus frowned. "What's this?" "For the kid," she said softly. Yeah, Marcus glanced at Jamal. "You don't have to," but she was already walking away. Inside the envelope was a $20 bill. Marcus looked at Daniel. "This is too much." Daniel shook his head. "No." He gestured toward the growing line outside. "This is just the beginning." Throughout the morning, people came and went. Some left tips. Some brought bags of groceries. One man dropped off a stack of winter coats. And a teacher from a nearby school offered Jamal help enrolling in after-school programs. Marcus tried to keep up with cooking, but the kindness in the room kept building faster than he could process it. At one point, he leaned against the counter and laughed quietly. "What is happening?" Daniel took a sip of coffee. "People are remembering something." "What?" Daniel looked around the diner again. "How easy it is to care." The sunlight through the windows grew warmer as the morning passed. Once for the first time in years, Sunrise Corner truly felt like its name, a place where something bright could start. Marcus watched Jamal finish his breakfast. The boy wiped syrup from his chin and looked up. "Do I still have to sleep in the car?" Marcus crouched beside him. "No." Jamal blinked. "Really?" Marcus nodded. "We're going to figure something out." Daniel stepped beside them. "That part," he said gently, "has already started." Marcus looked at him. Daniel smiled. "So the company has a small community housing program." Jamal's eyes widened. Marcus let out a slow breath. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "I told you." Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed. "All because of a bowl of soup." Daniel corrected him. "No." He looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "All because of the kind of man you chose to be." The diner buzzed with life around them. Coffee cups clinked. Laughter echoed between the booths. And outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the streets of Southside Chicago. Marcus stood behind the grill again, flipping eggs like he had done 1,000 times before. But now, every person in that room understood something important. Kindness was never small. Sometimes it just needed someone brave enough to start it. And on a rainy morning in Chicago, all it took was a man who ordered toast, and a cook who refused to forget what hunger felt like. Sunrise Corner glowed with warm light as the day continued. And Marcus Reed kept cooking, the same man he had always been. Only now, the whole world knew his name, but stories like Marcus Reed's don't really end. Because somewhere tonight, there's another person who feels invisible. Another person choosing kindness even when nobody is watching. So here's something simple I'd love to ask you. If you believe the world still needs more people like Marcus, just type 1 in the comments. Or if you believe one small act of kindness can change someone's life, type 0. No long message needed, just a 1 or a 0. I read the comments and I'd really love to see what you think. And if this story moved you even a little, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because right here we tell real stories about quiet heroes, unexpected kindness, and the moments that change lives forever. The next story might surprise you even more. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.